Prime Minister Narendra Modi is in Kyiv. He has in fact landed at the hotel here at Presidency, where he is interacting with the Indian diaspora at the moment. His visit to Ukraine comes amidst a surge in the war against Russia. He's concluded a two-day visit to Poland as well. Now, of course, he is in Kyiv, slated to meet Volodymyr Zelensky very shortly. Of course, taking forth his message of peace, once again emphasizing that this is not an era of war. A solution is not to be found on the battlefield, but via dialogue and diplomacy. Now, joining us on this very special telecast is Mr. Harsha Vardhan Shringla, the Chief Coordinator for India's G20 Presidency in 2023. He's previously served as the Foreign Secretary of India and India's Ambassador to the United States of America, High Commissioner to Bangladesh and Ambassador to Thailand as well. Good afternoon, sir, and thank you so very much for joining us today. Now, all eyes are on Bharat with Prime Minister Modi's visit to Kyiv, and the world's lens is especially on whether India can broker peace. Do you think this visit then is a global moment of hope?
To Ukraine, and also the first time that India is offering to extend all cooperation on an issue of global importance. So it's important from all three standpoints. It's historic, it's the first visit to the Ukraine, and it's the first time that India seeks to offer its support on an issue that is of global significance.
Indeed, sir, and Prime Minister Modi is perhaps one of the few world leaders who can visit both Moscow as well as Kyiv. Do you think then this is testament to India's role as a Vishbandhu?
Well, there are world leaders speaking to President Putin, there are world leaders speaking to President Zelensky, but there are very few world leaders that have the stature and the capacity to speak to both President Zelensky and President Putin. So I think it is Prime Minister Modi's own stature and the respect he commands on the international stage. It is also India's positioning as a country, a growing power, a growing global power, I would say. And perhaps our time has come. This is India's moment in which we can contribute to issues relating to global peace and diplomacy instead of responding and reacting to events around us and international developments. We are taking the initiative. We are offering to extend all cooperation to restore peace and stability through dialogue and diplomacy in the Ukraine conflict, representing the voice of the global South, articulating the concerns and priorities of the developing world. And I think from that point of view, any contribution that Prime Minister Modi can make on his visit by bringing the two sides closer together, by building confidence, and in that sense, by enabling the two sides to move closer to the negotiating table, I think is a great contribution to global peace and stability.
Indeed, sir, you have put it very well. Prime Minister Modi is, of course, carrying forward India's ethos of unity and amity to Kyiv as well. We've seen how exactly in the G20 summit itself last year, everybody had signed the Delhi Declaration despite hostilities in Ukraine. There was a large-scale consensus, but things have changed over the last year. There is a surge in the fighting that is taking place. I'm referring particularly to the Ukrainian offensive in Kursk. Now, it's been more than 900 days since the war commenced in February 22, yet it continues to drag on even as the people of both Ukraine and Russia are still suffering. Sir, in your opinion, where exactly does the root problem lie then?
Well, you're correct in saying that the war has taken a different course. It has involved first a Russian incursion into Ukraine. After that, there was a bit of a stalemate. Ukraine made some gains, then Russia has made some gains. But the last initiative is that taken by Ukraine to take a part of Russian territory in the Kursk region. And I think it's still holding on to about 1,200 square kilometers in the Kursk region. And I think the fact that the conflict does not seem to have run its natural course. In other words, conflicts can end when both sides reach a stalemate, or both sides one side emerges victorious over the other side. But in this case, it is neither of the two scenarios. But in whatever the situation, I think the fact that territorial gains are being sought by Ukraine, and Russia is seeking to also consolidate its gains in the Donetsk and Luhansk region, indicates that both sides are preparing for that end game when you will come down to negotiations based on territorial advantage. So clearly, there is some movement towards a certain conclusion, not immediately, but I think in the near future, we will see some steps that will bring them, to some sort of conclusion, whether it's a ceasefire or whether it's a negotiated settlement. That's a different issue, but possibly we might be seeing the conclusion of this conflict in the next near to medium term.
And so, speaking of possible solution, a possible conclusion, India still remains resolute despite the increase in hostilities in continuing diplomatic efforts to maintain a sort of balance in the global order. And speaking of the effort to maintain peace, we have seen a summit take place earlier in June in Switzerland. In particular, it did end in a stalemate. Russia's absence, in fact, was palpable. So what, in your opinion, must be done to bring all the parties to the table?
Well, you're right in saying that it needs two hands to clap. And if you don't have both the protagonists, on the negotiating table, then you don't have negotiations. What Prime Minister Modi, I think, is seeking to do is to create that bridge between the two sides. He has met President Putin just recently. He's meeting President Zelensky in person now. He will definitely see what are the common areas where both sides can come together. How can you build confidence? And finally, how can you possibly encourage the two sides to come to the negotiating table? India's objective has always been a peaceful settlement of that dispute through negotiations, through diplomacy and dialogue. And India's position has been that you cannot resolve any issues through conflict. You have to come to the negotiating table. That message of India's message of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam will be taken by the Prime Minister to Ukraine. He has taken it to Russia already. And he will try and address President Zelensky on those terms, that he needs to look at how he could engage Russia, how Zelensky can engage Russia in trying to resolve this issue. Clearly, the gaps are there, but I think what Prime Minister Modi is doing is providing the goodwill, his good offices, to bridge those gaps.
And so, speaking of the gaps, we are seeing the fault lines continuing to aggravate. And taking a look at the larger picture, the assault is taking place on European turf, but the funding, the financing is primarily being done by the United States of America, that is sending military aid to Ukraine. The US has just cleared a tranche of $125 million, and this has taken the total package to $55.7 billion. That's quite a considerable amount. And in your assessment, why are these fault lines aggravating? What is the cause behind this?
Well, there's a lot of history to this, and it comes down right from 1991 with the breakup of the Soviet Union, when Russia was created, and parts of Russia were carved out into separate states, which were part of the Soviet Union, whether it's Georgia, or whether it is Azerbaijan, Armenia, or whether it is Ukraine, for that matter, and of course parts of the Warsaw Pact nations, which were behind the Iron Curtain in those days, were also became independent countries. Now, as NATO shifted eastwards, it involved many of the previous Warsaw Pact countries like Poland and the Czech Republic, etc. But as it shifts towards what is the former Soviet Union, I think the discomfort in Russia has been quite palpable. And I think the dispute really goes into whether NATO should be expanding eastwards, whether Russia feels its sovereignty and integrity is threatened by that eastward expansion. So there are historic reasons to this. And of course, between Ukraine and Russia also, there are some serious differences, after the Maidan protests that led to, the deposition of the then Prime Minister that was supported by Russia. brought in a certain, a different dispensation that was pro-West. So there is some history there as well, and there are also Russian-speaking populations, along the border of Russia and Ukraine, inside Ukraine, and that also is an issue because Russia feels that these are traditionally people that are part of the larger Russian territory. So there are many factors here which cannot be addressed in the short time that we have. But what is important to note is that these animosities go back a long way, and the fault lines clearly are based on the West's assumption that many of these countries must have the right to decide whether they want to join the EU, whether they want to join NATO, whether they should come under the Western umbrella. And Russia's own apprehensions that their own options and maneuverability were being very, very curtailed by this eastward expansion, and they were being threatened by countries, by NATO that was coming right to its doorstep. So this is the basic issue, and this is where I think the roots of the conflict lie. And we have to see how those issues can be addressed. Can we look at a simple ceasefire? Can we look at a larger solution? There have been many attempts at peace, the OSCE process, there has been a Paris process, there's been other processes, but none of these have been successful in the long term. The fact that conflict broke out itself is an indication that these conflicts, that the conflict and the basic differences have not been resolved. So it's a very deep-rooted issue, and whether these can be resolved have to be seen. But what is important is to bring an end to the conflict and try and see how reconstruction can take place. Ukraine needs billions of dollars in reconstruction. How we could probably lead normal lives on both sides, and thereby, I think also allow the entire world the satisfaction of not having a conflict that impacts on their lives through energy and food insecurity and other ways.
All right, sir, my last question. Another interesting development is taking place this time within the United States of America. I'm referring to the US elections that are on the anvil. It's a heated contest between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. In your opinion, what are the implications of the possible result that might come out if Harris is elected to power or if Trump is?
For India, you mean?
For the war in particular.
Well, I mean, we have very different approaches when it comes to, the foreign policy or external engagement. I think Vice President Kamala Harris will carry forward the legacy of President Biden, which is a sort of a legacy that involves support for its NATO partners and allies, and limited intervention in areas of conflict which are there around the world. A sort of a soft touch, if you can say. I think former President Trump will have a more robust approach on certain conflicts, and in certain areas he will also try and either resolve those issues or withdraw from those issues. So they have implications on conflicts such as the ones in Ukraine and West Asia, depending on which side comes in. One other possible difference is that Trump is likely to focus more on Indochina. And this, from our perspective, is important. But from a global perspective, I think if you look at it, it depends where you look at it from. From a European perspective, I think it really means that Trump's coming into the presidency would mean that the US will want NATO to do, will want Europe to do its own heavy lifting, will want Europe to contribute more for its own defense. And the United States will take a less, I would say, prominent position in that regard. But again, these are difficult. These are the broad postures that we see now. It's difficult to say how things will actually work in practice when and if President Trump were to be in office. With Kamala Harris, as I said, it will be more of a continuation of the policy of President Biden, which means support for Ukraine and its conflict, continued engagement in that front, and a sort of effort to engage China in a manner that would reduce its any impact that it would have that would impact adversely on the United States and the global scenario. So security also would be important. But it would not be as pronounced as one that President Trump may manifest in terms of his own Indo-Pacific policy. So there are differences in nuance and differences in approach. But I think, we would either see continuity in U.S. policy, U.S. foreign policy, or we will see a certain, a certain pragmatism and flexibility that Trump might bring in under his presidency. But there are implications for all concerned. However it turns out, in whichever of the two contenders emerge victorious in the US presidential elections later this year.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.